Family Reunion by Sinclair.
Tales from the Cryptkeeper.
Clive had been sent for counseling because of the incident. Clive was in his first semester of uni, and the incident had involved a girl who had a figure that, as some posters on the walls of male students' digs said, had curves in places other girls didn't have places. The girl's boyfriend had been involved, and a major meltdown on Clive's part had most definitely been involved. In fact, it had mainly been the terrible distress he exhibited which had alarmed people, including a lecturer who was unfortunately there, that had got him sent for counseling rather than the incident itself, which had been more pushing and shoving than anything else. It also didn't help that what Clive's late granny, who had been Scottish, would have called the drink had been a factor. Clive's counselor was a soft-voiced, thin, dark-haired woman who wore long, many-colored beads round her neck and who had abstract art prints on the wall of her office. Lots of blues and greens. He suspected she would have been strikingly attractive about 10 years ago. Now she looked kind of desiccated. He thought his granny would have said she needed a good plate of mince and tatties, but he didn't think the counselor ate any meat. He was also pretty sure Granny would have described the woman as a daft wifey. He got the strong impression the counselor would be into crystals and Reiki in her own time, but gallantly kept it down at work. Clive had known what to do, having been sent for counseling, namely to give the daft wifey lots of what she wrongly thought she wanted to hear. Clive was good at talking, always had been, although he was often shy and awkward at first. His granny had once said that the boy's vocabulary and facility with English are going to be a handicap with him being from Manchester. His mum, who was Mancunian and English on both sides of her family, thank you very much, had on hearing this aside, muttered something under her breath. Clive wasn't sure, but he thought some of it had been old porridge, and then a racist epithet that his mother would otherwise have condemned out of hand under all circumstances. What made it worse was that his mum was a lifelong Labour voter, and his dad who hadn't defended his own mother at all. So Clive had told the counselor lots about the hell he'd had in high school, and lots of other stuff, and she ate it up. She wasn't used to clients who were this open, especially the boys, and he allowed her to think she could help him adjust his internal narrative. And he led her to believe he was open to being magnanimous about certain stuff, and that he could be positive and move on. She'd been pleased. Her first impression of the slightly short, slightly overweight, not very attractive boy was that he was one of those people she tried not to think of as painfully ordinary. She was pleased by the openness. And it was all a lie, because what Clive wanted was to kill everyone, not a few like one of those stupid American school shooters, but everyone. He was unimaginably dangerous. He didn't know how dangerous he was. Nobody did. At the end of the second counseling session, the counselor had also surprised herself. She kind of broke protocol and suggested he might try selling spiritual practices. Unfortunately, he was going to. The only person he had ever cared for or liked in any way was his paternal grandmother. She was from the Southwest Highlands. The bit they don't think of as the Highlands, but actually still is, she was fond of saying. His happiest memories were his holidays at her house. Clive was a boy who noticed things. One year he and his parents, he was an only child, had gone on holiday to the USA, to a very famous theme park, and he had noticed stuff. Although he had enjoyed himself at times, he noticed all the interminable time they stood in queues, what the Americans called standing in line. And he noticed all the people who were so fat they were kind of scary. Fat, as in not a bit chubby like him, but generate your own gravity fat. Also how people couldn't understand his and his parents' accents. And he had overheard someone saying, "With teeth like those, I knew the kid was a Brit before he spoke." He noted how people stuffed themselves like pigs and you still had to go to the toilet. It was all a lie. At his granny's it was different. She was different. She was one of those educated, working-class Scottish people. A side benefit of Presbyterianism, there had to be one, she had liked to say. Name a book and she'd read it and understood it. She always said things that amused him, things that he instinctively knew were true. You could almost, so to speak, pick what she said up and feel the truth in it. like the time he'd asked why they made a fuss about Ireland in America and dyed rivers green, but not a fuss about Scotland. He never forgot her answer. Because we're Protestants. Less show business value in films. Second, don't let people hear kid ye on. We're Brits, same as you. That empire business was almost more ours than yours. Finally, what do you expect from a republic that celebrates Colonial Treason Day every 4th of July? But more importantly, they've never forgiven us for winning. Unlike the Welsh and the Irish, we held you off for all those years. The price, in some ways, was to be forgotten. But he had never forgotten what she said. Often, he thought, she was the only one who ever talked to me. He'd been amused by her in other ways. He liked it when she was sarcastic about those people, even though he was one, calling being ill poorly, always forgetting to give you a biscuit with your cup of tea. Men who have purses, flouncy, lazy blonde women who go to the pub too much, laughing at things that aren't funny but are cruel. It must be yon horrible chalky water. And she said cheeky things about Scotland. Every day spent where I live is a success, because it's not the Central Belt. And look at this rubbish, that's all that would be on the telly after their precious independence. But she would always add, well, Clive could be worse. Your mum's dad could have been called Ashley. There were proper hills where she lived. Hills that she sometimes called non-academic mountains. You could walk there all day and never see another soul. He didn't even mind when it rained. They would look at old films and read. What he didn't know was that in the last few years before she died, she had been increasingly worried about the boy. She lived in a place where self-destruction was, for a large minority, an unofficial blood sport. Sometimes it was the drink, like her grandfather. Sometimes fat, salt, and sugar combined with TV. Don't be too critical, Clive. It rained for 2 months non-stop last year. Then, of course, there was the violent, all-too-final kind. He had begun to remind her of her grandfather, and there had been a dark bit there, all right, bitter, difficult. It was an integral part of her beliefs, based proudly and consciously on her culture, that cynicism is healthy, but only if mixed with lots of kindness. Although she took some satisfaction when the next-door neighbor's drains collapsed, she went out of her way to help them out, commiserating with them over the price of repairs, whilst congratulating herself she was still in a council house. It was she who, although she considered him an annoying old sweetie wife, who made sure Mr. McDonald from across the road always had a hot meal when he started going downhill. She was afraid that, like her grandfather, the boy had started to lose this quality. Life was getting to him. She had too much life experience to question how she knew this. Only kindness would save him, from other people and from himself. She had been planning to have a very long talk with the boy when he visited, but that was when she'd taken ill. And there was another reason. Always had been. He was like her grandfather in another way. When Clive had been no more than 4 or 5, he had been up on a visit with his mum and dad. At that time, they didn't just drop him off for a week or 2, but stayed as well. Even though the place clearly bored his cow of a mother to death. And the child had told them he had seen something. At the back of the garden, looking down over the fence into the wood and the burn that flowed there. Clive's mother had just said, "Don't know where he gets his imagination." But she herself had been vaguely disturbed. It was only later that night, as she got ready for bed, that she understood why. She remembered the old woman who had told her a story when she was only a few years older than her grandson. The old woman had not been able to talk English without reverting every so often to the Gaelic, and her grandson had described in his childish prattle something very like what the old woman had talked of. It was a bit like hearing that something from that Welshman who had written "The White People" was real. Her grandfather had also seen strange things. Seeing these things could be very dangerous. The desire that everyone be done away with had been growing for years. It had only quickened with his grandmother's death. It had been reinforced somewhat by the knowledge that there was nothing he could do about it. Therefore, it was harmless. His experience in the first few weeks of university had confirmed it. Firstly, he noticed he wasn't being bullied. And if he wasn't being bullied now, then the swine had only did it because they wanted to. If they were able to stop all along, why hadn't they? Wasn't it perhaps that all they'd ever worried about was what they thought of each other? It made it worse, and they were really the same people, just with slightly different faces and names. The place itself was a disappointing confirmation of this. Having raised himself on books and films about Cambridge and Oxford, this red brick ex-technical college dump was proof of how awful everything was, how awful they were. There were other things. He was struggling with the work, already. Always having found it hard to concentrate, he had made up for it in high school by studying badly twice as often. He sensed this wasn't going to work here. Just as the counselor would later want him to be magnanimous to people who themselves not only never would be, but he was now also going to be punished for not taking the path of least resistance by people who always did, because they could. As always, he noticed stuff, like how conservative with a small c they all were, the natural conservatism of kids who lack life experience. The arguments and falling outs in the halls were all really about the shock that some people put the orange squash in the fridge. Some people called tea and coffee just dirty water, and so on. Not the reasons people thought they were because of. And why did the girls behave suddenly, just like the girls they had slagged off in third and fourth year? Wasn't this very unfair? On the night of the incident, he had got talking to the girl. He had had lots to drink, and he became voluble and expansive. He had poured lots of this out. It was a bit funny, because he was one of the only boys who had not got drunk in high school. He'd been too busy studying badly. She wasn't used to being treated as an equal by boys as she was so pretty. Although she thought that's what she was used to. Some of it must have reached her because she started to cry. And the incident, including his meltdown, had happened. This was the final confirmation of his desire to kill them all. When he'd come away from his latest counseling session, he'd gone to a pub. He thought that the drink was going to be a bit of a problem for him. As always, he noticed the irony in this. He seemed to get drunk because he'd gone out and had to deal with people, not because of going out to get drunk. Someone at the bar had asked him why he wasn't at primary school, and laughed. This didn't improve his mood, but he got served. He noticed the junk shop and the thing in its window a few doors along when he was going back to his flat. A narrow, dirty-looking place, sandwiched between charity shops. The thing was small, perhaps only 7 or 8 inches high, and partially hidden by a set of china dogs and a pile of old LPs. Not bothering to analyze the impulse, he went in and asked to have a look at it. Afterwards, he thought its green and red flecked color must have caught his eye. The old boy who ran the place had happily gone and got it for Clive. The old boy handed it to him with shaking, none too clean, nicotine-stained hands. Clive bought it for £5. It was a little figurine, made of something that looked a bit like soapstone, but wasn't. It appeared to represent a thin, sheeted figure. It was literally mostly covered in what simply looked like a sheet. The feet were visible and looked to be clad in something like sandals. The sheet ended about halfway down thin, almost spindly calves. The outline of a thin left arm could be made out, held slightly away from the body. Only part of the right arm and a complete, long-fingered right hand was visible. The delicate, graceful hand is open and upright, as if in a kind of benediction. The completely covered head was bowed down, so that, if visible, the subject's chin must have been resting on the top of the chest. Somehow the head looked too big for the narrow shoulders. The overall effect was incredibly sad and pathetic, even tragic. He wasn't sure, but he thought it was old, really old. He laughed at himself later as he studied the thing in his room. He had known from the start that there was something a little strange about what, he supposed, might be called the dimensions of the figure. But he hadn't noticed that the hand, held up as if in blessing, had 6 fingers. The extra one was between the thumb and forefinger. And yes, there was an extra toe on each long, thin, sandal-clad foot. Disturbed, he put the thing down on his windowsill, where it mutely stood. Late that night, Clive sat there studying badly. He'd opened the window as it was a warm summer's night. He didn't notice that the sounds of the city outside had ceased. Instead, he first became aware of the smell. Not the usual smells of a small British city, but a rank, rich smell. one that was somehow evocative of the color green in his mind. And he had also become aware of strange noises. Noises that absolutely didn't belong. What sounded like the croaking of innumerable toads and frogs. When he looked up from his desk and out the window, the city was gone. In its place, he looked out at a strange, huge open space covered in huge cyclopean crumbling stone blocks that formed half-fallen circular towers and thin, massively tall, broken pyramids. All were covered and half-choked with rank green creepers. The plain was lit by the light of a huge full moon, a moon the color of blood. The entire scene was pregnant with terrible dread and sadness. Somehow, Clive found himself climbing, seemingly against his will, through the window and out onto the plain. This plain was level with what had been a third-floor window. The smell of lush, rank vegetation was strong, and he felt a wet, heavy heat that was almost overpowering. He walked out onto the plain into what had apparently been a huge plaza or public square. The huge ruins towered all around, lit by the red light of the moon. A moon which he noted was not only unnaturally low, but somehow less marked looking than he thought it usually was. And then the first of thousands of figures emerged from the shadows of the ruins. They poured in an endless procession from low doorways at the base of the broken towers and down from other similar doors in the middle slopes of the vine-draped pyramids. Endless waves. They were yellow, mummy-like dead things, creatures with big round heads on curiously long necks. They held out yellow, withered hands, as if in pleading supplication. Or were they reaching for him? The hands, of course, all had 6 fingers. Clive found that his terror was so great he couldn't move. It reminded him of what he'd heard about some people during mass shootings in the USA. One of his legs could only twitch idiotically. As the figures got nearer, he smelled an odor that was like a mixture of spices and old leaves. And under this, another unmistakable smell. He began to see more individual details. They were all naked, small and thin, with big heads. No eyes, they had all fallen in long ago. Thin, gash-like mouths that sometimes joined naked and empty nasal cavities. And all bore the unmistakable wounds of violent deaths. Some had no heads, others had heads damaged by savage blows. Here and there, he saw that some of them had what looked like arrows and spears sticking from their bodies. Many of the women also had horrible marks on their throats. A week later, Clive walked into the counselor's office. She had immediately felt something was different. Wrong. The boy had looked her up and down, with no effort to hide it. A bit like how some posh boys and men had used to look at her 20 years ago, when they were still allowed to do that. But this look was worse. And, given, she was sure, for different reasons. He greeted her easily and began to talk, but she could tell he didn't care whether she caught all the words. He seemed to still have a lot to say. He regarded her with eyes that looked at him, but also through her, as if she was just there to take the place of a bigger audience. She didn't think he was ordinary anymore. She didn't know why. It was very disturbing. As the boy talked, her thoughts turned briefly to her father. He had been a C of E vicar. During one of innumerable discussions that were really arguments, she'd told him she found his dogma chilling. She'd asked him in all your harsh, cold talk about the father, where is the mother? What about those of us who want to find her? His response had annoyed her, as he often annoyed her. Looking for yourself, I think. Yourself. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, and chasing after the wind. And she remembered something else. In his sermons, he sometimes talked about words that were wormwood and gall. Every word this boy said was like that. They were like acid that was falling drop by drop into a pool of clear water. Wormwood and Gall. He'd begun, "Do you think there's spiritual truth in the Bible?" She'd answered, "I think there's truth to be found in all trad." But he'd interrupted. There seemed to be no stopping him. He had something to say, and he was going to say it. I met some people the other day, and these people, they told me the real story of Cain and Abel. Not the stupid one, the true one. You see, there were these clever people who had lived peacefully on Earth for a long, long time. They explored the world, but they left most of it in peace for the animals and birds. Trees. They only sometimes ate fish and a few birds. Red meat made them ill, and usually they only ate the ones they kept and farmed. Mostly, they ate fruit. They were clever, and they were always on the verge of doing amazing things. like reading each other's minds and moving stuff just by thinking. Some of them, a few, could do it a little bit already. They were good at making things, had 6 fingers on each hand, nimble, dexterous. They were all small and thin with big heads. When the first babies were born with only 5 fingers on each hand and heads that were too small, they didn't hurt them. The people were kind. They were always kind. It was their nature. And besides, it wasn't as if most babies weren't still born normal. And it wasn't the baby's fault. And the babies were their brothers and sisters. But problems soon started. As the babies with 5 fingers grew, they turned out to be violent, vicious, and it soon became clear they were far bigger and stronger about the arms and shoulders, especially the boys. Soon there were beatings, murders. The people with small heads weren't as clever as their brothers and sisters, didn't seem to know how to behave like decent human beings. And as the girls with small heads and 5 fingers grew into women, it got worse. Normal 6-fingered women could only have 3 or 4 babies in a lifetime. The 5-fingered ones could have 6, 9, even 12 or more, like rats, and always the same as their small-headed mothers. The clever little people began to fear they would be overrun. The counselor had tried to interrupt several times. At his last words, she crossed her hands protectively over her own flat stomach. Not aware she did so, a word she didn't like came into her head. Mad. They tried to cope, to help them, for a long time. But when the big animals began to be slaughtered for meat, when it wasn't safe to go out at night in parts of their own beautiful, clean cities, they decided something had to be done. Even then, they weren't cruel. They gave the big people with small heads lots of food and tools, lots of help, and sent them north. They could still share the world with them, they said, but the proper place for them was up near the ice shelf. They didn't want to do it, but they could do it, as there were still lots more normal 6-fingered people. So the violent, cruel, big, stupid people were sent away north. If a child was born like that, they were looked after and sent to a camp and then guided north, always in groups and with food and supplies. After a while, no more 5-fingered children were born. The people who had them in their families decided it was best not to have any more children. They weren't selfish people. Instead, they agreed to adopt children whose parents had died. The others, those ones with small heads and 5 fingers and toes, had disappeared into the vast north. Clive paused. But then they came back. After many, many centuries, thousands of them, tens on tens of thousands, endless numbers, legions, he led them. The crawling chaos, he who shall not be named. I don't think you've got books on a spiritual leader like him. But he's mentioned in a book that was written by a mad Arab. How he dressed and appeared was what lots of later kings were based on. The people he led have always liked a bit of flash. They came with spears and axes, bows, after all, big muscles and big hips. That's all that's ever mattered to those people. And the little people were all murdered, slaughtered. They did try to fight, they weren't cowards. And by that time, many more of them could do amazing things with their minds. Just not enough. They got beat down, they all died. Not surprising if you've ever watched the History Channel. The counselor really did try and insist on talking then. On trying to tell him he needed help she wasn't qualified to give him. He just went on talking. In the place they've been, they've become what you would probably describe as mindful. I think you would say that, wouldn't you? They have, I think, perfected what you would call certain spiritual practices. After all, they've had the time. But after 200,000 years in the dark together, they don't want to change their internal narrative. Not after what happened to the children. And they're not kind anymore. Clive got up and withdrew from his backpack, not 1 but 2 identical little greenish figurines. He placed these on her table. The table was low, had a box of hankies on it, side by side. They gave me one of these, to complete the set. There was one thing they couldn't do themselves. I must decide. If it's going to happen, I must choose. He smiled at her. Then Clive held his hands over the curious little figures and said one word, "Enter." The table collapsed, as if under a sudden and tremendous weight, and a strange blue-green rectangular shape began to appear in the air. The counselor couldn't move. She could only look, her mouth pinched into a circle of astonishment. Through the blue-green light movement, it was a door. And suddenly a face began to appear through the light. It emerged like something rising from murky waters. She was reminded of pictures of Egyptian mummies and the gray aliens of modern mythology. The lipless gash of a mouth twitched. A withered six-fingered hand appeared. Waving gently, bolts of energy crackling between the fingers. As the creature emerged and walked into the room, it was followed by others. Quietly, Clive said, "It's time for you and everyone else to meet the rest of the family. They have some catching up to do."
Tales from the Cryptkeeper.
In the depths of human imagination.
The hour of shrouding mystery is upon us.
In his house at Rulia, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing.
We live on a placid island of ignorance.
Have you checked the children?
The more I see of what you call civilization, the more highly I think of what you call savagery. The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be.
Where past and future collide, new nightmares are born.
The weird tales of yesterday meet the dark visions of tomorrow. The Weird Fiction Hub. Are you ready?